Well, a cemetery is certainly a strange place to start a pub crawl, but today I'm in Dublin visiting one of their most famous pubs, if not one of the most famous pubs in the whole of Ireland. And of course, what pub would be on the side of a cemetery? You guessed it, it is the Famous Gravediggers. Just look at it. And they're opening up for us to go behind the scenes and meet the team.
Hi, I'm Ciaran Kavanagh from John Kavanagh's The Gravediggers. I'm one of the seventh generation to run this pub since 1833. My father took over here in 1973 and he was the sixth generation at the time. The first John Kavanagh opened the pub in 1833 and then it was his son John and then his son Joseph and then his son John and then his son John and then my dad Eugene. And so it's John, Joseph, John, Eugene. So my dad used to work for Guinness's and he took redundancy in 1973, sold his house and then he moved down here with us, the family, and we started living upstairs. Nobody lived upstairs since the 1950s, so it was quite interesting, it was quite dilapidated and my mum was kind of a bit upset because she had to live above a pub. At that time, my granddad was running the pub, he was a little bit elderly, so we'd close the pub sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes in the evening, and in the 6 o'clock news, for example, he'd go behind where the kitchen is and he'd listen to the news for about half an hour to an hour. So if he didn't have the pint then, the locals say, you better get a pint now because John is gone for an hour or so. At that time, we had Alsatian dogs, German Shepherds, and they used to stand behind the counter. So if you tried to take anything from behind the counter, the dog would go. And I actually have a police report from 1948 which mentions the dog about trying to attack the policeman when he was coming in to check the pub. So we live, as I said, above the pub. My mum and my 2 brothers live here at the moment. I grew up on that side of the counter, so I could swear at 3 years old. I started pulling my first pints when I was about 7, 8, and started working when I was about 11, standing on a crate pulling a pint like we all did. Yeah, so Dad worked for Guinness's, never drank, and he had a really good idea how Guinness should be poured and looked after. So he was probably the first person to double cool Guinness. This is before cold rooms started, chill rooms. So he did that, and underneath counters, ice banked the Guinness to go over twice and it would be extra cold. So he could also see that you needed to keep the head down a bit lower, so you need to make sure it was chilled as much as you could. And then he built next door in 1978, and I started food there in 2005. So this is my great-grandmother, Josephine McKenna Kavanagh, and she ran the pub with her husband, John, from 1911 to 1943. And then her son, John Kavanagh, took over, my granddad, and that's his wife, Nellie, there. And this was a day out in the 1950s when the pubs were closed, either Patrick's Day or Good Friday. They took all the locals in the area out for a day trip somewhere else. And yeah, so this is Josie. She pretty much started the grocery side with her son, or her stepfather, Joseph, back in the 1900s. So when the square was built in 1900, they started to come here for groceries as well as pints. It's kind of cool. So where we are now is a snug, and this snug was, like most Irish pub snugs, it's just at the entrance to the pub on the right-hand side, or left-hand side, and the ladies back in the day, you can see the door here. The ladies would come in with their husbands or boyfriends and drink in here, or with their friends, whilst in the main bar, the gentlemen would drink. It was kind of separated. Women could work behind the counter until they got married, and then when they got married, they had to become housewives, like in most jobs. So 1950s, a snug was kind of used. So since the 1950s, this has been closed, and I kind of convinced the family to open this up just after COVID to put some of our older, vulnerable guests into the place, like some older locals, and it kind of works as a kind of spillover for a bit older gentlemen and ladies to have a quiet drink. So it's kind of done full circle.
Don't expect to turn up and be allowed into this. This is
this is a new edition, a very special edition.
And also you can once you're in, you're in.
You're in.
You're in. Look, you're locked. You're in. You're in, and your pints come through the hatch.
There's a little hatch there, just right here, and that opens up, and you can put your drinks through there. So that goes. Basically, when everybody in 1940s was a lot smaller, they couldn't see over the top, so it's kind of private. And this has been the main entrance since 1833. The only thing that's changed since 1833 is that my father moved the counter back. So where that bench is just over here, and that pole, the counter was actually this side of it. So you'd have your drinks here. And the barman had much more space there. And behind you there, we have some of the old pictures. You have Gene Wilder, who did a movie called Quacks Their Fortune, has a cousin in the Bronx. And he didn't like Guinness, so he drank Coca-Cola with a Guinness head at the time. Up here we have the billhead, which says J. Kavanagh Prospect Avenue, because before it was a square, it was an avenue, there was no houses here. And that's where we bottled our own Guinness. And that's basically, every pub a bottle of Guinness had a little sign to say it. Here we have our chucker out. That's older than the pub, actually. This guy called Or Pembry, and his models were all circus performers. So this is a chucker out, so a bouncer or a doorman. And it says if you, all persons using bad language, asking for credit, or being disorderly, the nearest hospital is the Mater. So that's not too far away. It's about 5 minutes walk. So that's the first chucker out and the oldest thing in the building. Here, if you come in, there's a story my dad tells about the history of the pub. It was quite interesting. So this is the original bar. As I said, the counter moved back. As you can see, it's quite smoky. It was quite smoky up to 2004. The last time it was painted was 1994. And the wall was the same. So 1994, that was painted. So we have the swinging doors here. A lot of people say, why do we have swinging doors? Why in Dublin have we a saloon? So basically it was to do with the fact that this was the grocery part. So when your kids were coming in, or Mommy and Daddy were coming to get the groceries, they wouldn't see you drinking down the back. So you had your office area here with the weighing scales. And in those little presses there and those little drawers, you'd have like barley, starch, all the stuff you needed. Like a lot of country pubs you'll see will become undertakers or hardware shops. The reason why they became undertakers was because in 1848, after the famine, they put the Coroner's Act that a pub could hold the body overnight because of their cellars.
Their cellars would be cold.
Colder, so the next day they could bring it to the mortuary or whatever. So that's why a lot of pubs in the country especially became undertakers. So they'd get you drunk, kill you off, and then bury you. A guy gets his jug of porter. So before bottles or takeaway Guinness, you get a jar of porter. So obviously the guys have thrown a snowball at the dog. The dog's knocked your man over and his porter's gone on the ground. So it's probably the saddest Christmas postcard you could ever have. The next picture is Daniel O'Connell. And Daniel O'Connell built the cemetery next door, but he also brewed ale with his brother, O'Connell's Ale. And I'll show you a billhead down there which mentions it. But in 1832, he built that cemetery. And the O'Neill family who owned this house knew him and said, oh, let's open up a pub. And then the first John Kavanagh married their daughter, hence us being here. But this mentions Daniel O'Connell got rid of the toll gate that used to be up the top of the road to visit the cemetery. So he said, listen, not fair that people have to pay to see their loved ones. So he drove a horse and cart through it to break the toll. And then here we have the ringboard, which is the most strangest thing you could see in a pub, but it used to be very common in Irish pubs, especially in Dublin. So instead of darts, quite dangerous sport, as we all know.
Well, give a drunk a dart.
Yeah, give somebody drinking a dart. Instead, you give them a rubber ring and you throw the rings and hang it up to 13, 12, 11, just like darts, but much safer.
Yes.
And this basket here is not to protect it, it's actually to catch the rings that you don't hang.
Yeah.
There's a couple of games you can play, and one includes putting a large bottle of Guinness on it, empty, and you have to hang all the rings on that. Very few people can do that. It's very talented. Through that door was the old toilets. The old customers would call it walking the plank. There was no roof. So when you look at the Gene Wilder movie I mentioned, you can actually see him sitting on our toilet reading the newspaper, hiding from the police. So it's on YouTube. You can see it. It's a very funny movie. And you see how the pub was before we did all the changes. My dad, as I said, moved the counter back. So where the glass on the swinging doors was actually where the counter was. So that's why you have the tap heads here over a hatch. So it was all rearranged, and the cuts here was to fit it in. This was an office, so it was closed to the public. So he just moved it back and made it bigger and opened up from 10:30 to 11 at the time. And that's when the younger people start coming to the pub, and that's when they saw the Gravediggers drinking here, hence the name the Gravediggers. Before it was known as Josie's, and I showed you Josephine McKenna Kavanagh, and she ran the pub pretty much for 30 odd years. During the First World War, the Civil War, Arab Rebellion, and half of the Second World War, a woman ran this pub.
Yeah, okay.
Up here is an example of what my great-grandfather Joseph Kavanagh did, and that was advertise outside a cemetery because the main gate here was closed in 1878, and we lost a lot of business then. So he went up to the new main gate and started handing out these flyers, and it says Skittles and shooting range. So through the door to the toilets over there used to be a shooting range with air guns and bowling like Skittles. And he also served cheese sandwiches and ham sandwiches. So he was quite innovative. He had fought in the American Civil War, so I think he saw a lot of things in the States and brought them back in the 1870s. So we never really did food here. My mum did food in the 70s, and it was kind of like soups and sandwiches, not toasted. Cheese is a great thing if you're drinking, especially beer, because it kind of keeps you going. It's not too hard in your tummy. So a lot of guys
cheese toasty and Guinness. That's like a proper. That's
well,
totally
before
a
the
proper
bread
meal.
was invented, it was just a lump of cheese. So you'd go into a pub and there'd be a lump of cheese on the counter, and you'd help yourself, maybe some raw onion.
Yeah.
Really weird. And when I came home here, the barman used to do this for some of the lads when they were a bit hungry. It's a slice of cheese and off they went. So the cheese toast has become a kind of like a real kind of Dublin pub thing, as Irish pub thing as well. It's handy to make. Whilst here, my parents built next door in 1979. I'm a chef. I've been away for 15 years. I came home. It wasn't performing so much, so I kind of redesigned it and started doing food, toasted sandwiches and soup. And I still do toasted sandwiches and soup, but then it kind of evolved in, I wanted to do some dishes that would have been here back in the 1900s. So Coddle is one of the ones, which is a Dublin stew. And every family has a different recipe. Every part of Dublin has a different recipe for Coddle. Pork was the most eaten animal here because it had all our rubbish there. It was garbage disposal.
Yeah.
And we ate them and we salted them. And then on a Thursday before Friday, when you had to eat fish, you'd boil all the pork up you'd left over, sausages, everything, throw it in, and that's a Coddle. And you'd boil it up, turn it off. Saturday you could have meat, come back from the pub after a few pints, eat your Coddle. So most single men can make a Coddle, and their mum taught them or their dad taught them. So everybody has a different Coddle. Very controversial. So I have to call mine Ciaran's Coddle, because if I don't, it's like, it's not like my mammy's. So I couldn't do burgers or wings because I didn't think it'd suit the place. So I wanted to do stuff that you could still have a few pints, afford to have a few pints, and that wouldn't fill you, and it was kind of traditional. So yeah. Of the entrance to the cemetery. Above it says Beati Morti Queen Domino Morino. My Latin is really bad. This gate was open from 1832 to 1878. After that, it closed, so we lost a lot of business. So all the funerals came through here. The hearses would wait outside to go inside. There was a small chapel here. They'd leave the bodies there to be picked up to go to the cemetery if it was busy. Sometimes they'd wait outside, and sometimes they'd wait inside. Yeah,
so they moved. So they just the entrance is on the other side now.
The entrance is on the main road, and the reason they put it there was far away from here, and there was nothing else there. And they bought the land in front of it and put another part of the cemetery, so nobody else could open up a pub. So when they closed that gate in 1878...
Oh, so they did it on purpose because they did not want people coming to the pub?
Because what was happening was a lot of people were in the pub and forgetting to go to the funeral or to bring the body, or they left a priest in the pub. So one of the commissioners of the cemetery said that's not happening anymore. So they closed the gate in 1878. So we lost a lot of revenue. The gravediggers couldn't get a drink anymore. So they got really peed off. And the gate was locked. You couldn't get out. Couldn't get in. Definitely couldn't get out because you're dead. But they'd knock on the wall. So if you follow me over here and through the railings, you can see the wall of the pub. So the grave diggers would come and knock on it with a shovel. And then my dad or my grandfather, even my eldest brother was the last guy to do it, would come out and put their drinks through the railings. They'd drink them there, or else they'd take them away and pay later at the end of the week with their tips. People think there's a hole in the wall that drink went through, but that's kind of an urban myth.
Yeah,
so it went on for a long time.
There you go, you get Guinness through there.
You can actually get 33 pints of Guinness along the railings. They've counted it. There's some guys, we call them the outsiders, they drink at night time, and at closing time they'll buy 3 pints and they'll leave them here and they'll drink and have a chat. So a lot of people drink outside now. Unfortunately, it's not in green, it's just along here, and you still see people putting their pints on the railings, which is kind of nice. Sometimes you'll see them gazing quite seriously into the cemetery, like, oh, cheer up, you're not in there yet. So that's lovely. It's quite unique. It's a big connection between us and the cemetery. So good and bad. It's good now.
Yeah, it's good now. It's good. It's a special pub. It's a really special pub. Yes. Thank you so much for
very much.
sharing the stories. It's been really good fun. Yeah, they're perfect pints of Guinness. Best ones I've had. Well, I told you that was going to be special, and Ciaran was an amazing host. I hope you enjoyed the pub, and make sure you like, subscribe and follow the channel because there'll be many more to come.